kind of a whole topic in of itself you could make your own presentation of is the relationship and connections between cartels and governments. And we won't really get into that, but one important thing to remember, just some of that's speculation, some of that's anecdotal, some of that's pretty obvious when you see it happen. But for example, like the Losetas, they're a breakoff of some military individuals who were actually trained by the US government in a lot of areas in the East Coast, mostly North Carolina. And that's well documented, right? Like there are some things that are just like, you can actually trace back the US government like feeding these cartels. But then beyond that, I guess, I don't know if we have enough to convince most people here, right? You can make a presentation on itself between the connections between cartels and governments. Not talking about much difference.
And so related to that, of course, like border militarization is happening on the US-Mexico border, but US-sponsored militarization is also happening within Mexico, within Central America and South America. Like, I'm sure that people are aware of the resources that the US has devoted to places like Colombia for the purposes of drug interdiction. A similar thing is happening in Mexico with the Merida Initiative. The United States funneling resources, funneling training and weapons to military and paramilitary forces in Mexico, ostensibly to fight drug trafficking. Of course, I guess like the next slide illustrates, like it has also resulted in people being tortured and human rights abuses, and people suffering an enormous amount because as these military resources are funneled towards Mexico. I don't know if you want to say anything else about this.
Yeah, can cruise through. There's a lot to cover.
Yeah. Bringing it back to Arizona, I think like people are aware that Arizona doesn't have a very good reputation right now. And like living in Arizona is in many ways living in a climate of racism and of white supremacy. Both legislatively, obviously people, like, I think most people are aware of SB 1070 that was put into effect last July, and like other legislation coming out of Arizona that essentially criminalizes immigrant communities. At the same time, there's also sort of just a like general trend of increasing white supremacy, of increasing like organization among white supremacists who are traveling to Arizona. So just a little bit of stupid artwork by those folks. But one thing that we want to really illustrate is that those in some ways are two separate spheres, right? Legislation and then like the culture and the environment. But at the same time, they're linked. And I think that like just one really concrete way of illustrating that is that Russell Pierce, who essentially introduced and sponsored SB 1070 and has recently this year introduced and sponsored like whole barrage of racist legislation, has direct and like documented connections to white supremacists, to organized white supremacists, to people who are members of the National Socialist Movement. And those are like connections that are very, very real. And on the surface, like legislatively, the like white supremacist tone isn't explicit, but the connections between like a culture of white supremacy and the legislation that's coming out of Arizona are really, really direct.
Yeah, J.T. Reddy is the person's name. If anyone's interested, there are a number of connections, but J.T. Reddy and Russell Pierce are good friends. Cool, so we'll transition over. Please jump in on this too, Matt, if you want to. So the topic of increased criminalization is something that we want to mention and actually drive home hard in this presentation, that SB 1070 isn't the issue. SB 1070 is a sliver. The pieces of legislation being discussed in Utah right now aren't the issues, they're slivers. And it's really concerning, I think, for us and for a lot of people when those become the spotlight. And so we want to describe the various ways that criminalization has been increasing, not just through this one piece, this token piece that's become a pet for the media, because it's actually a lot more complicated, and in many ways the situation was just as egregious. It was just as fucked up prior to I would say as fucked up prior to SB 1070 being signed in some ways. In other ways it's getting worse, but there are a number of programs that I think need to be mentioned. Operation Streamline is one of them. It's a way for the US government to mass prosecute individuals that they apprehend. It's basically just flooding people through the court systems. From day one have been trying to do more, to this day they're trying to do more. They want to double it. What's currently happening is about 70 to 100 people are being mass processed at 5 different locations across the border. 70 in Tucson, we see 70 a day there, and these people are shackled hand to feet. They stand up in a big group of people and say together, guilty or not guilty. After a group of public defenders sued the courts because of due process issues, they had to alter the process slightly, right? So now, instead of 70 standing up at once, you have groups of 7, or groups of 10 with rows of 7 go up and say it together and then go through each individually. They've seen a lawyer for about, I don't know how many minutes, don't get anything really described, and that way people, instead of getting this really relatively small infraction before, you're getting a misdemeanor, you're getting time served, and pleading down from a felony most times, meaning people of course are going to take it. Instead of a felony and time in jail, you're getting a misdemeanor, but that also would mean, in most cases, you're prohibited from re-entering. That means applying. Obviously still entering would be illegal, right? Re-entering for either 5, 10, 15, 20, or life. You do it again, you're looking at felonies. This is a way that the prison industrial complex also is feeding people through our prison systems. This is a way that short-term detention and private companies like CCA and Geo Group are really profiting. So we'll get a little bit more into that later. But that's really concerning, it's continuing to grow. So there are these things I mentioned. There's SB 1070. I really don't want to spend much time on it there because I think most people have some sort of background, and that's not what this is really about. There are plenty of pieces of legislation trying to cut social services beyond just that piece, 2008, but there's other ones as well. 2281, the RASA studies has been getting targeted as well, trying to control what people are able to even study in schools. It's the whole slew of white supremacy trying to permeate through basically every part of our society. But these are the things we want to go through really quick. 287G is referring to a type of program that would allow for cross-deputization of law enforcement. So traditionally, right, or strange word, previously we'll say we had the INS. You have the federal government who enforces immigration control, immigration. They're the ones who would actually be able to deport someone, right? Apprehend, even ask about someone's legal status in the United States. In, what was it, 96, we had a big immigration package come in, and a section of it was called 287G that allowed for the cross-deputization, basically meaning police agents can act as immigration agents. And in many cases, the most egregious of which, especially the law that everyone's pretending is good here, not only are you allowed to, you are forced to. By law, with SB 1070, with what we just had passed here, I don't know the number. Someone know the number?
116.
It was 116, right? So that makes it a requirement that the police ask about someone's legal status in the United States. Here, it's for certain types of crimes, but SB 1070, it would be across the board. Anyway, that was a federal piece of legislation allowing all these different state pieces to go through. Secure communities is something different that sometimes doesn't get enough attention. I want to describe that a bit right now. Secure communities is a different way of finding out if someone's legal status in the United States. This happens when somebody is getting processed through a jail. It many times doesn't even have to be a jail. You hear stories about it all across the board. We'll have another slide about this, but I'm going to try to go through all these pretty quick and skip some of the slides so we can get to the heart of the presentation. But secure communities would mean that an individual, once picked up, then goes in and they have their fingerprint ran through a national or a federal immigration database, right? So secure communities basically undermine, it essentially does the same thing as a 287G, but it also undermines that. This doesn't have to go through and get like the type of legislation that we're seeing in our state, in this state, and other states to pass it. This is a program implemented by the Department of Homeland Security themselves, and they work through municipalities, through jails. Right now, about 33 states, and I don't know how many hundreds of municipalities have this program. It's estimated, or the goal, right? Janet Napolitano has the goal of putting in secure communities in every last state, every last municipality by the end of 2013. That's their goal. A lot of people think they'll reach it. I guess, you know, if they reach it right that day or not is not the real issue. The issue is, no matter where you go, you're going to be getting run through an immigration database. And this isn't actually if you're charged or if you're found guilty, right? So this can still just be on like a bogus claim, which is what happens. Most people actually aren't convicted when they get deported through a secure communities apprehension. They're turned over to ICE because that allowed them to. So these are just the ways that federal, state governments, local governments are holding hands.